We all go through different chapters in our lives, some stranger than others. Welcome to Strange Chapters, where we bring you true stories of the strange, the macabre, the paranormal, and the supernatural. So sit back, relax, and let's get to this week's featured author and their stories. Hey everybody, welcome back to Strange Chapters. I am your narrator and host as usual, Eric Freeman Sims. Today we are featuring 3 stories from author Von Brashler. His book is Time Shifts, Experiences of Slipping into the Past and the Future. His books are available on Amazon, Kindle, anywhere fine books are sold. So sit back, relax, and let's get strange. Story 1. One confused 12-year-old boy. I have personally experienced time shifts, which began when I was 12. Actually, I suspect that many people have experienced time slips without fully realizing it or allowing themselves to accept it. Eventually, I was forced to accept the reality of my first sidestep into non-ordinary reality outside normal time and space, but initially I shrugged it off with confusion because I lacked the ability to grasp the situation. It might be clear to you at this point that time shifts can be very personal and often do not seem to involve anyone else, making them hard to reconcile and accept. Most likely there is no point of reference to relate to anyone else or no point of reference in your prior experience. The lonely feeling that engenders, I can assure you, leaves you hanging out there all by yourself in left field with a strange story that nobody around you is likely to believe. People do not simply suddenly sidestep into another time and place and then step back here, do they? Well, I did. The day started out without incident or warning of what was about to happen to me. I got onto a yellow school bus with other kids from my neighborhood in Everett, Washington. We weren't going to school that day, but climbed aboard the converted bus that would take us to Berryfields out of town. There we spent the day playing in the dirt between rows of planted strawberries. It may not sound like fun, but we found ways to make the day enjoyable. Also, we could make a little pocket money spending the day out of town this way. We would pick berries for the owners of the farm, and they would pay us for our labor. Our mothers seemed glad to put us on a bus out of town under the supervision of the people who ran the berry farm. Honestly, I did not work that hard at this. My usual routine was to sing rowdy songs with my friends on the bus, pick a handful or 2 of berries to eat on the spot, and then disappear to the swimming hole at the river where many other pickers spent their lunch hour. I think I actually turned in a few boxes of picked berries once or twice, but mostly I just played and had fun. The field was several miles from town in which we lived. I didn't really know the route to the berry field, for I'd never really paid attention to the roads we'd taken to get there. I just noticed that we always crossed a railroad track at its entrance. One day at the berry field, I became extremely sick to my stomach. My friend suggested that I'd eaten too many berries and then gone swimming on a full tummy. But I felt deep inside me that it was more serious than that. I had never felt anything like it before and really wanted to go home right then and there. I asked the bus driver to immediately take me home, but he said that I'd have to wait to ride home with the others at the end of the day. It was only midday, however, so I searched for the field boss for some help to get home. He told me the same thing. I felt that I could not wait, so I pondered how to get home on my own. Mind you, this was before cell phones, so I could not call home. Nor could I call anyone I knew from the field, so I decided I would need to find my own way home. I looked at the entrance to the field, which was over the train tracks, and figured it was my way out of the berry patch. But I did not know what roads to take once I reached the entrance, which direction to go, or how long such a walk might take a 12-year-old boy. Then I thought about walking down the railroad tracks. I decided that they would take me back to Everett. I told my friends I was going to get home that way, but they didn't believe me. They assumed I'd just wait for the bus. I got onto the tracks and turned left, which I believed to be the direction of home. I envisioned how the tracks crossed right in front of my house. I did not even consider whether this was the same train track that led to my street in Everett. Train tracks, of course, make all kinds of switchbacks with various line spurs going every which way. But I got it into my favorite little brain that these tracks passed in front of my home. So I started walking down the tracks. The last thing I remember of the trip was running the first curve in the track. That prevented me from looking back at the berry field I just left. The very next thing I recall was standing in front of my family's house in Everett, miles from the berry field. It was still afternoon, as though little or no time had actually passed, and I wasn't tired from walking. Relieved, I walked up the steps to my front door and went inside. My mother was not home yet. My brother, sister, and father were not home either. Apparently, it was early afternoon. I went inside and flopped on my mother's bed on the first floor, since I did not feel well enough to walk up the steep steps to my second floor bedroom. I felt really out of it, racked with pain. I waited until my mother came home and simply told her that I felt very sick to my stomach and that I'd come home early as a result. She gave me a lemon lime soda, thinking it would settle my tummy. When I felt even worse the next morning, she called our family physician, who told her to bring me to the hospital immediately for an appendectomy. At the hospital, our doctor called from his golf course to tell the staff to keep me on ice and prep for emergency surgery while he finished the last 9 holes. By the time he arrived, my appendix had burst. Fortunately, I survived the experience and soon found myself recovering at home with ice cream, another of my mother's remedies for sick days. I did not think much about my amazing trip from the berry field once I got home. I was just happy to be back to normal. I had a foggy memory of walking to Everett on railroad tracks that seemed to take me instantly to my home in the blink of an eye. I did not pay any attention to my lucky sense of direction and speedy trip. When you're 12 years old, you don't question finding your way home. You're only glad that you made it home safely. You don't try to analyze the details. In this case, I was unable to analyze the details. That is, until the following summer. Then it hit me hard. I was 13 at the time and had been playing in the backyard of that same family house in Everett. I was practicing fly casting in the enclosed yard. I stopped to recline on my back in the plush grass and looked skyward into the summer sun. I suddenly remember doing much the same thing on a similar summer afternoon 1 year earlier. Then I remember walking on the railroad tracks. Like a forgotten dream, little bits of the story started coming back to me. I remembered that I had squinted at the sun during my walk on the rails and tried to determine what time of day it was and how long it might take me to get home before dark. I tried to remember more of this ordeal, but found it difficult to do so. I stood up and continued to practice fly casting. My neighbor, a retired butcher, had encouraged me to take up fly fishing. He had given me old copies of his fishing magazines and told me how to practice casting. Standing in the back of the yard, I could cast all the way across the backyard to the white, wooden front fence, which was 6 feet tall and separated our backyard from the front yard. I watched the line zoom out as I did this. Sometimes it would reach the bottom of the fence, and sometimes it would strike it. And then sometimes my line would fly all the way over the top of the fence. When the fly on the end of my line caught the top of the wooden fence, I walked over to pry it loose and looked beyond the fence. On the other side of it, beyond that front yard, was a street that ran by our home. It was called Virginia Avenue, and there were other houses on either side of it. That's when it really hit me. There were no train tracks in front of our house, and there never had been. At last, I remembered another part of the long-dismissed story about my journey home. I remember walking on train tracks with the idea that they would take me home. I stood staring at the street in front of my house for some time, realizing that nothing about the entire trip from the berry field to my home made any sense to me. It was illogical. It was as though I had stepped outside of normal time and space. There was simply no other explanation for it. The faint images of my strange encounter played in my mind as I continued to cast my fly rod again and again in the direction of Virginia Avenue. My elderly neighbor watched from the second floor kitchen window next door and came out to comment on my progress. I believe I pretty much ignored him as I continued the casting motion over and over. My mind stuck on reliving the odd details that I had suddenly recalled on my walk home the previous summer. I had the strange idea that if I could go through the casting motions over and over, that I'd be able to define what had happened and reach some measure of inner satisfaction. I continued casting as I thought it through, but every cast was about the same, and the details of my walk on the railroad tracks to my front door never became apparent either. There would always be a hitch in these things, I decided. So, I tried to tuck away the memories of my bizarre walk once again, for there were no railroad tracks in front of my home in Everett. It was an old mill town that had been created when a railroad man decided to build a track from his home in St. Paul, Minnesota, to a settlement in the Pacific Northwest. Everett was part of the Washington Territory and featured the Snohomish River on one side and Port Gardner Bay on the other. One side of town subsequently became known as Riverside, while the other end of town became known as Bayside. I lived in the middle of this town, halfway between Riverside and Bayside. The railroad tracks ran along the river in Riverside on one side of town, and beside the bay in Bayside at the other end of town. The only place train tracks did not run in our town was down the middle of town, where I lived. About 3 years later, my family moved 5 miles north to the outskirts of Maryville, Washington. One of the first things I noticed about this new family home was that the railroad tracks ran directly in front of the house, and you needed to drive over these tracks to get to our new home. Is this what I've been envisioning before I began my journey from the berry fields years before? In any event, once again the memories of my bizarre journey home from the berry field 4 years earlier came flooding back to me. I think this is how time works. It includes everything, including what we commonly consider our past, present, and future. It includes all outcomes and situations. It is not really fixed in the way we typically think it is. It is fluid and loops back on itself. Our perception allows us to fix our attention on only one instant as now. but there are many other now instances on the loop. I believe the little boy from the berry field somehow sidestepped onto another parallel space and time, a space and time that he desperately needed, into which he somehow fixed his perception. It's also possible, I suppose, that some guardian angel carried me home, or maybe intelligent aliens abducted and transported me, but I do not remember anything like that. I do recall that I willed myself to be home, and then suddenly I was home. In doing so, I traveled miles from the berry fields with no map to guide me, and at almost the same time that it had been when I left on my journey. I do not think I could even find that berry field today. It was way out there in the country someplace. There is quite a bit of synchronicity to this personal story. Synchronicities seem to appear quite often in stories of time slips. The depth psychologist Carl Jung coined the term synchronicity to describe meaningful coincidences in our lives. Synchronicities tend to appear over and over, often in similar but slightly different situations, to bring our conscious attention to something of cosmic importance that we need to face. It seems that there is such a thing as happenstance in Jung's evaluation, but at the same time, it also sees significant meaning in our coincidences. They have karmic importance to our personal growth and understanding. It is apparently the way that the universe continues to bring matters of personal significance before our attention in repeating fashion until we get the message and deal with it. Here's some more coincidence in my story of the train tracks from St. Paul, Minnesota to the Everett area in the state of Washington. I never thought I would leave the Pacific Northwest, but the company that employed me decided to move our office to the Twin Cities. The new office was in South Minneapolis. I had been given scant notice that the owner of our company wanted to move us to the Twin Cities in Minnesota. A few months before he decided to make the move and informed us about it, I was on a business flight from the West Coast to New York. A flight attendant gave me a card and suggested that I call her for yoga training when I moved to the Twin Cities. She lived there and routinely flew from Portland to New York. I told her I had no plans to be in the Twin Cities. She said to call her when I got there. A few months later, my boss announced the move, and I indeed relocated to the Twin Cities. I called this flight attendant to take her up on her offer of group and individual yoga classes. I kept her card even though at the time I thought I'd never need it. As another coincidence, this woman taught me yoga and how masters could learn to experience time and space outside of normal time and space. Her training was special and changed my life. In time, she moved away to start her own yoga school. I moved away too when I took a job in another state. 4 years later, however, I returned to St. Paul. By coincidence, a business in my field offered me a job there. It was perfect for me. I took the job and moved into a Victorian house in the same neighborhood where railroad magnate James J. Hill had lived. In fact, the house was built during the same time that he'd been building his Great Northern Railroad from St. Paul to Everett, Washington. He would have been right at home in the Victorian house. What a coincidence, right? Story 2. A Brother and Sister Reunion. My mother told me the most amazing personal story of time travel. It involved her and her brother. It was a vision that she could not get out of her head, so she told me the story year after year. Even now, it does not seem to make much sense to me. It did not make much sense to her either, even after years of reflection. But that is the way things appear to us out of time and space, like an upside-down world where we have no solid bearings to help us make sense of the things we see. To understand the closeness of my mother and her brother, I need to tell you a little about their family and the farm where they spent their childhood. It was a wheat farm in North Dakota, a rural area settled by German and Norwegian immigrants for the most part. My mother and uncle were third-generation Prussians on their father's side and third-generation Norwegians on their mother's side. The farm was their security in the new land. My mother and her brothers grew up playing together because the nearest neighbors lived very far away. They either walked or cross-country skied to school, which was located a few miles away. When it snowed hard in the winter, they could not see out the windows. With the snow piled so high, they had to walk from the house to the barn and other shelters by clutching a clothesline strung between the buildings. The little community church was where everyone came together. Children were born at home, usually with no record of birth except an entry in a little book in the white church. Because there were so many children in their family, as with many farm families, they watched after each other while the men were working the fields and the women were cooking, canning, and cleaning. My mother had 2 older brothers and 2 young brothers whom she took under her wing like a mother hen. When they got older, my mother and her older brother would attend high school away from home, boarding with the family in a neighboring town. It was a safe and secure environment in many ways. During the years of the Great Depression, they'd always had a garden due to their mother's green thumb, and they always had animals for milk and meat. Hobos would hop off the train to eat a sandwich at their back porch. For many people in that time and place, life was not easy. My mother left the family farm after high school during the war years to work at a Catholic hospital in Duluth, Minnesota. One of her older brothers, Vernon, had already left home to join the Navy as a medic stationed in the Philippines. One day, shortly after Vern had shipped out, My mother had what she called a strange vision. The way she remembered the incident, she was standing just outside the family's house. She started to walk toward the barn and then looked up when something rather strange caught her attention. She said the whole scene seemed a little out of sorts, almost surreal. Things around her did not appear quite as they had a moment prior. It seemed like a different time of day and another season. Out of nowhere, she said, she saw a young man walking to the gate of the corral. He was older than she was, but not yet middle-aged. She noticed that he was wearing a white short-sleeved shirt. He looked athletic and trim. Strangely, the man looked familiar to her, although she could not place him. Because he was some distance from her, with his face turned down to open the gate, she was not able to see him clearly. Then the gate swung open, and the man disappeared. She blinked her eyes in disbelief. He had seemed to simply vanish right in front of her, and she could not reconcile what she had seen. She ran back into the house to find someone to tell, but found herself alone. When she went back outside, she found the gate to the corral shut and nobody in sight. Also, the scene had reverted to the sort of day and season she had initially observed before the man made a strange appearance. She ran toward the corral area to try to find the mysterious man or some clue about what she had witnessed. Curiously, she found nothing out of sorts. Once again, she found herself completely alone and without any explanation. After that, she convinced herself that it had been sort of a daydream. She decided that there had never been any young man in a white shirt walking through the gate. It was some sort of mirage. Maybe the light had played tricks on her, she thought. Maybe it was the summer heat affecting her. Clearly there had been nobody there. However, the incident was printed indelibly on her mind. She knew what she had seen and could not forget it. The memory and uncertainty of what she had witnessed remained on her mind for many years. When she tried to sort things out immediately after the incident, she did what people often do when trying to reconcile things they witnessed that don't seem to add up. She went over the vision again and again, searching for clues to piece together the puzzle. My mother's first reaction on the day of the incident was to find someone to help her make sense of what had just happened. When she did get a chance to talk to someone about it later in the day, she merely hinted at something that she might have seen out of the corner of one eye. She pestered family members later in the day to see if they might have seen a young man in a white shirt on the premises. She asked her family members who such a person might have been. However, nobody could help her. So she just dropped the subject out of fear of looking odd and unbalanced. She tucked away the memory, trying to forget it. Still, she knew what she had witnessed. It was very clear to her that she couldn't shake it. The image had been very vivid and very real to her, if only for a moment. It played on her subconscious mind, causing her to have recurring dreams about it for many years. The more she had this recurring dream, the more she questioned whether the whole memory of seeing the young man in the white shirt that day had been nothing more than a dream in the first place. When she completed her high school years in the neighboring town, she left North Dakota and the family farm to work beside the north shore of Lake Superior in Minnesota. The hospital where she worked offered her a grand view of the Great Lake from the third floor obstetrics ward, which was her post. She would look out the window into the vast depth of the lake for hours, wondering where her life would take her and wondering whether she would ever see her brothers again. Again, the war years were a difficult time for many people, including civilians back home. Everyone must have felt rudderless back then. My mother left her job at the Duluth Hospital, which overlooked the lake, and followed her aunt to Everett, Washington. Several relatives have found jobs there. When they both lived on the family farm, her aunt had helped my mother prepare a daily spread of food for the field workers during harvest. Her aunt took my mother into her new home in Everett, and my mother lived there with her aunt and cousins before meeting a returning soldier. She moved out when she married my father, who was home from the war. So many returning soldiers were starting over, and my mother wondered when she would see any of her brothers again. In the meantime, her two older brothers had grown into men. The elder one was taking an active role in running the family farm, having taken over this responsibility due to their father's failing health. Vernon, her other older brother, and in the Navy, had served as a Navy medic in the Philippines, where he found jungle conditions after Japanese occupation very difficult. Many men stationed in the jungle were in poor health. Whatever toll deprivation and oppression placed on them was made worse by jungle diseases. Vern was lucky to make it out of the Philippines in one piece and happy to take off his uniform at the end of the war. He'd made many friends in the Navy, and they decided to travel across the country at the end of the war to celebrate the new freedom. A lot of the men seemed to do that following their service. They would take some time to collect themselves after the ordeal with a sort of victory tour through the countryside. Vern and his friends found their way to his sister's home in Everett, Washington. There, Vern met his brother-in-law and two young nephews for the first time. He was happy, carefree, and seemingly healthy. Unfortunately, Vern did not realize that he had developed tuberculosis in the Philippines. The former medic would whoop it up in town part of the day with his two Navy buddies and then return to the little house in Everett to spend time with his sister and her family. It was a small house, but his sister found places for all three Navy veterans to sleep for several nights. Vern seemed delighted to spend time with his sister's two toddlers and play with them every chance he got, sharing his contagious laugh and sense of fun with the two boys. The younger of the two, my younger brother, had a severe breathing problem, which was a family concern. Consequently, Vern had to be careful not to overtax the toddler and all the fun and play. When Vern and his comrades left, my younger brother took a turn for the worse, finding it even harder to breathe. The family soon learned that his condition was now complicated by tuberculosis. Vern would soon discover that he himself suffered from tuberculosis as well. He was otherwise in good health, young and fit. He had apparently lived with tuberculosis for some time. Consequently, it didn't derail him as quickly as it did my younger brother, who died at the age of 2. The local hospital advised my parents to rush my gasping brother to the University Hospital in Seattle, where they had a better respirator that was more suitable for a child. Driving at breakneck speed down the old highway with a police escort one night, they still arrived at the Seattle hospital too late. The funeral for my younger brother, Daryl James, was preceded by the funeral for my Uncle Vernon back in North Dakota. I remember traveling with my mother and father to the family farm for the ceremony and the family gathering afterward. We stayed a few days. This was my mother's only visit to the family farm in many years. While only 5 years older myself, I remember the visit very well. I recall taking a bath in a horse trough, which relatives there found hilarious. I remember the comfortable old farmhouse and its porch. I remember grandmother's huge garden, and I remember the chicken coop, the barn, and the corral. My mother stared out from the house porch of the corral one hot summer afternoon and fixed her gaze on its gate. She seemed almost transfixed, as though deep in thought. She was remembering that other summer afternoon years ago when she stood by the house and seen what looked like a young man in a white short-sleeved shirt open the gate. She said nothing about her reflection, but when we returned home, she began to tell me about her strange vision again. Maybe talking about such an odd occurrence with your little boy was not as threatening as discussing it seriously with another adult. She said she had experienced a sort of flashback to her earlier vision at the family farm, and with this, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. She realized that the man in the white shirt had been her brother Vernon. It was not the young Vernon she remembered when they were youngsters, together back then on the farm, but a young man fresh from the Navy, trim and vibrant. She knew that man now. She had not been able to recognize him years earlier because he had been just a boy back then. My mother never spoke of the strange vision, as she called it, as a moment out of time. I don't believe anyone ever knew she used that term or considered the possibility of time shifts either. Instead, they talked about visions, strange images, imagination, and dreams. They had no other frame of reference. It does make sense, however, that her brother would want to finally return home for the family reunion on the occasion of his physical passing, and it would seem logical for him, upon his return to his boyhood home, to open the gate and walk through it once and for all. And it's only logical that he would shut the gate after passing through it. He had disappeared and wasn't coming back. My mother continued to discuss the story with me for many years, so I know it had left a lasting impression on her. She felt that it was meant only for her to experience. A dear friend and colleague of mine, Frank Joseph, has written many fine books on synchronicity as meaningful coincidence. The phenomena of synchronicity seems to have karmic significance for the person who experiences it, in his view. We might think of it as the cosmos giving us repeated clues about things we need to contemplate in our lives, so as to grow in depth and understanding. Maybe that was the case here. Certainly, there seems to be a certain amount of synchronicity in my mother's story, if we consider the repeating pattern of events and circumstances involved. Historically, people would often shun, ignore, or doubt the divine insight and direction offered to them by ancient oracles. They would choose to direct their own lives and find their own way along life's path. We see in classical Greek mythology how people would sometimes need to see things of personal importance dramatically revealed to them. For instance, the wrong decision by Paris when asked by Zeus to name which of the goddesses was the most beautiful forced him into the Trojan War. He chose Aphrodite, who promised him the earthly beauty Helen of Troy in exchange for deciding in her favor. His answer infuriated the other goddesses, and his capture of Helen launched the war. A similar bad choice during the Trojan War was made by King Odysseus. His ignorance and defiance of the gods caused his ship home to become drastically off course in storms sent his way by the god of the sea. This long journey home forced him to confront many challenges to finally bring him to his senses. Similarly, the ancient Hindu story in the Bhagavad Gita shows a warrior who has personally shown the impact of his choices by the Lord, who acts as his chariot driver through several battles. It seems that the cosmic solution to getting people to confront their choices of their lives is to repeatedly put them in positions that make them focus on the issues associated with their choices. For many of us, these obstacles might seem like the craziest kind of bad luck and timing, but these myths simply imply that they are rather an opportunity put in our path to force us to focus and make good choices. My mother was no warrior, world explorer, or Trojan princess. She was, however, a woman who clearly saw some significance in a strange situation that had been placed in front of her one warm summer day. Even in her declining senior years, when she was put in a nursing home and could remember little more than her own name, she remembered the man who mysteriously appeared in a white shirt at the gate and then disappeared. I recall visiting her in the nursing home to sit with her and take her for wheelchair rides through the North Dakota town where she lived her final days. Outwardly, she appeared largely unresponsive to people and things around her, while other residents of the nursing home watched television or looked at the fish tank. An attendant would try to engage her in conversation or would toss her a huge lightweight beach ball when she sat on the sofa. She would just stare ahead of her as though lost in thought. She continued to do this until the attendants would take her to the dining room to eat or to her room to sleep. On one of her final days, I wheeled her to a nearby restaurant for a nice Sunday dinner. She ate and smiled, but otherwise spoke very little. Then she leaned over the rail of her wheelchair to speak. "You seem like a nice man," she told me. "Are you my brother?" Her brother Vern was always on her mind, it seemed, even at the end when so little memories remained. It was as though she always expected him to suddenly pop into her life again as a young man. This story reminds me of an old calculator I once found in an abandoned bank building that I converted to a newspaper office in Petersburg, Alaska. I plugged the adding machine into the wall and gave it a problem to solve. It continued to grind away for hours, unable to find the answer. I thought about unplugging it, but instead just let it continue trying to work through the problem. I was concerned that it was stuck in that one spot and that would only keep returning to it if I didn't let it reach some conclusion. It never came up with an answer, but started to smoke. Before I recognized it and pulled the plug, the room was filled with smoke. The smoke-filled building was reported, and the island's volunteer fire department responded immediately. I think the old bank's calculator was a little like my mother's mind, grinding away at a problem she could not easily solve, but she kept trying. At one point, like my mother, I was tempted to classify her story of the strange vision in a way that seemed more familiar to me. I referred to it for some time as a ghostly presence. Ghosts usually haunt a specific time and do not travel back in time from what I have heard of such sightings. But I imagine that non-physical spirits would not be restricted by our normal laws of physics and could move more freely. No, I think it's more likely that my mother as a girl saw her brother in another time when she took one step off her farmhouse porch and suddenly saw everything in front of her with a slightly different hue. The time of day and season seemed a little different to her, just as the strange man appeared and opened the gate. The vision ended when he disappeared in front of her eyes. I submit that she likely experienced a time slip. Story 3. Moving in the Light. It might seem difficult, if not impossible, for us as human beings to live beyond the linear limits of our three-dimensional world. That's certainly the cultural attitude we inherit. That orientation is further defined by our personal frame of reference. But I would suggest that limited view is based more on the perception of walls around us and our relative situation in our environment than absolute restrictions. Our physical senses allow us to see only three dimensions and a fixed world that is set in a form without any flexibility that would allow us to reach beyond what we immediately see. Several years ago, I met a sage from India who forever changed my own view on such human limitations. He was as mysterious as the message he gave me. He delivered this message over time in a series of 3 strange phone calls when I was working on the second floor of the Theosophical Publishing House in Wheaton, Illinois. I had no idea who this man was or why he'd single me out for his phone calls. I had just started working for the publishing division of the publishing house. I shared an office at the end of the second floor of the building, above the organization's Quest bookshop, and just down the hallway from my personal apartment on the second floor. It was a sunny office space that enjoyed an amazing amount of sunlight that streamed through the wraparound windows in my half of the suite. I shared my corner of the office with a lot of happy aloe vera plants and citrus plants that soaked up the intense natural light and grew to immense size, wrapping themselves around all the windows like pretty ribbons. I hadn't been working there long before I received a most unusual phone call one summer afternoon. The call came out of the blue and left me scratching my head afterward. On the other end of my landline was the voice of what sounded like an old man from India, a gentleman with a very thick accent. He was quite polite and invited me on a lightning tour of India in the fall. He said that he led these tours of India every year and found September to be the ideal time to go. According to him, this tour would change my life forever. I asked him who he was and why he had selected me to invite on his tour. He ignored both questions and continued to promote the value of this journey to me personally. It occurred to me that he was probably calling from India on a landline, yet the long-distance phone call was quite clear. It was so clear, it was as if he was in the room with me. Regretfully, I told him I just started my job and was far too busy to take what sounded like a long vacation trip. I had just replaced Clarence Pete Peterson, an elderly man who had served as publication director for many years. In addition, I was helping to launch a new national magazine, The Quest, and developing a syndicated radio show for 37 stations as well as a companion television series for 13 stations. I was working in our little sound studio to help produce audio and video programs to add to our book line. If that was not enough, I was organizing public seminars and visiting regional media for events at our facility and larger presentations in Chicago. I was busy at that point and could not consider any personal trips. The Indian gentleman kindly listened to everything I said, and then repeated that I should join him on his lightning tour for an enlightening experience that would change my life. It occurred to me that he must have dialed my office in an attempt to reach my predecessor, Pete Peterson. After all, Pete and I had the same office and same phone extension. I asked the Indian gentleman if he had meant to call Pete and not me. He insisted that he wanted to speak to me and repeated that his information was important for me personally. After this first phone call, I wondered how he had located me. It dawned on me that he might have reached my office through the switchboard since I was new and unknown. So I asked our information officer, who fielded calls to the Theosophical Society in America and routed them to the appropriate phone extension throughout our two buildings. She just stared at me blankly and replied that she would have remembered routing a call about an elderly man with a thick Indian accent. She assured me that he had dialed me directly. So I began to think that the whole phone call was some elaborate prank being played on me by someone at our building or the administration building across the street. To reveal the person possibly behind such a prank, I scribed my phone call to various people on staff who I thought might have been able to disguise their voice enough to sound like an elderly man with a thick Indian accent. However, all the people I confronted face to face just stared at me without blinking, smiling, or displaying any other sort of telltale sign that an exposed gangster might reveal under such close scrutiny. I received another phone call from my mysterious caller several days later. Again, he urged me to join him on his lightning tour of India in the fall and gave the same reasons for my participation. I quizzed him about his name and affiliation once more and asked him why he had selected me. Again, he refused to answer these questions. He only said that he had chosen me as a person who would greatly benefit from the tour. After giving him my reasons why I couldn't go on his tour this autumn, and that once again hearing his promise of life-changing experience ahead of me, we ended our second call cordially. He said that he would call me again after I'd taken some time to reflect on his offer. This mysterious man with the Indian accent was beginning to stir my curiosity. I still had no clue to his identity, location, or connection to me. He didn't seem to know me, and yet he insisted that he had singled me out. I was so new at the Theosophical Publishing House that it seemed unlikely that anyone outside my friends, family, and coworkers at our two buildings really knew I was there at all. But I'd ask everyone I could think about the man and his strange phone calls without learning anything about him. Nobody in our two buildings had ever heard about an elderly Indian gentleman who led annual lightning tours to India, although many people seemed to think that it was indeed a chance of a lifetime. It occurred to me that the Theosophical Society, as an international organization with headquarters in India, probably had a number of members from India. So I called the national headquarters in Adyar to learn anything they might know about such a man. That proved to be a dead end too, as nobody there was able to help me whatsoever. Unable to sort out this puzzle, I tried to put this man and his curious phone calls out of my mind and forget that he ever called me. Days rolled by without another call, so I began to forget about my mystery caller altogether. Then one late summer afternoon, the phone at my corner office rang abruptly. I must say that I had the funniest feeling immediately, as though I recognized the way the phone rang and knew it would be an unusual call. The same elderly gentleman with the Indian accent asked whether I had thought about his offer and reconsidered. He reminded me that it would be a life-changing experience and a unique opportunity for me. Again, I was amazed how clear his voice seemed on this long-distance call. I assumed that he was calling from India, but really had no idea where he was located. Most phone calls, even local calls on that landline, were not that clear. I disappointed him again with a negative response to his offer, while trying to sound most appreciative and polite. Clearly, this old man thought that he was offering me a special opportunity and trying to get me to join him on his tour, despite my narrow, measured view of things. Realizing that he had failed to recruit me after numerous personal invitations, he then changed tactics. He said he could offer me something else that would change my life forever. He said I did not need to leave my home or job. He advised me how to meditate in the light, something he said would have far-reaching benefits if done correctly. He explained that this was an incredibly special form of yoga. I asked him what kind of light was needed and how I should meditate. He explained that I should meditate in the early morning light beside running water. He said that the first light of day held special properties. I responded that we had a pond on the office grounds next to a huge tree. I told him I could place a blanket on the grass under the tree and meditate beside the pond in the early morning light. There was only a little recirculating pump that stirred the water for the fountain, and it provided a tiny spray of water. That fountain and the fish in the pond were the only things that broke the stillness of the pond. He said little about the pond as I described it, only that it was a start. He said that it was important that I begin to practice this morning meditation regularly. You sit in the light, meditate in the light, and move in the light. He told me, be in the light. I asked him what he meant by move in the light. He responded that I must live in the light and become one with the light. I wondered aloud whether meditating in the light would train me to move in the light and become one with the light in time. As I recall, he said that I could only accomplish any of that with meditation. That was the last time I spoke with this mysterious sage. I subsequently found a blanket and placed it under the large cypress tree next to the pond. There I began to meditate in the early morning sunlight. I could feel the difference immediately. as the warmth of the sun and gurgling sound of the pond had a profound effect upon me. It was more than the warm feeling of the sun or the sound of the water. I felt transported to a new level of consciousness. I understood, once I began these morning meditations, that altering my consciousness and putting myself in the light would indeed transport me. I found myself leaving my body and having profound out-of-body experiences during these meditation sessions. But who is this man with this sage advice? I assumed that I would never know, but then decided to try looking for clues in our own bookshop. I asked our bookstore manager where the most reliable books by Indian mystics were situated among all the books we carried on yoga and meditation. She responded that the good stuff from respected Eastern teachers was located in one corner of the shop and pointing me in the right direction. I wandered into a corner and immediately saw one book that seemed to call out to me. It was displayed face out on a table easel. I turned it over and started reading the back cover. The book was written by an Indian master on his approach to meditating beside running water in the early morning sunlight. It said that he was also famous for organizing lightning tours in India every year in the fall. At the bottom, it listed when he was born and the year he died. The man had died a couple years earlier. That made me think the phone calls I'd received from my mystery man were indeed long-distance calls. It appeared to me that this master had called me from the great beyond. Clearly, he had learned to move in the light, for it appeared that death, distance, and time were no restrictions to him. He was indeed a master. But why had he singled me out? A few years later, when I moved from Illinois to Minnesota to work for another publisher, I seemed to get my answer, or at least I found a special use for his training other than personal meditation. My new roommate in St. Paul was a young woman who developed brain cancer that couldn't be removed by surgery or painful chemotherapy. When we placed her in hospice care to spend her last days confined to a bed she would never leave, it occurred to me that 32-year-old friend might benefit from meditating in the light. So we began to practice the Indian mystics meditation technique together. It's funny how the idea came to me and how I remembered the Indian master's technique in the middle of my friend's sad hospitalization. I saw how forlorn she was to be bedridden, with no prospect of ever walking out of that room or going anywhere ever again. It seemed that time had run out for her. My dying friend loved Star Trek and how the crew of the science fiction television show could relocate by stepping into a transporter device that illuminated them and moved their atoms across space to rematerialize far away. So I asked her if she would like to try a little meditation exercise that could move her in the light just like the Star Trek crew and their transporter. She had been depressed and unable to speak, but quickly nodded yes to my suggestion, smiling with anticipation. I told her that if we did these exercises perfectly, she could leave the confines of that room and leave her pain behind without her ever having to step out of bed. We moved her a little closer to the sunlight that streamed through the window. There was a huge water fountain just outside the hospice doors, one donated by friends of hospice patients. In the weeks that followed, I guided my dying friend daily on an out-of-body journey that brought her a great sense of release and freedom. Together we seemed to move in the light through various planes of reality hand in hand. In each new level of reality, the light seemed to change in intensity and color from white to red, orange, yellow, green, and eventually blue. She seemed to greatly enjoy these voyages as we meditated in the light together. She seemed to find it easier to do so each day, and in time she appeared comfortable making her way in the light on her own. When I commented how comfortable she had become with these meditations, and asked whether she felt that she could now move freely in the light by herself, she said the first words she'd been able to utter in weeks. Yes, she said positively with a smile. She tried to squeeze my hand as though to accent her enthusiasm. I told the head nurse that my friend was comfortable with her situation now and was ready to move on. The next day, my former roommate was declared legally dead. She had physically died, but I knew that she would be alive and just fine. Like the Indian mystic, death would not confine her, and neither would physical limitations. It dawned on me that a change in consciousness was key to her new freedom. She was no longer tied to one place and one time, but instead could move in a conscious body to various alternate realities, carried at the speed of light by the glow of the sun. After she died, my roommate's bedroom, emptied weeks earlier of all furniture and fixtures, played music from a corner where a stereo once sat. Pink ribbons, once tucked away in secret spots for a Christmas never celebrated, appeared in places where my roommate's cat would find them for play. When I visited the cemetery to visit her grave, I heard her voice inside my head, telling me very clearly, "You will not find me here." I think it's profound how that old man with a thick Indian accent had singled me out years earlier and insisted that I learn to meditate in the light. He was right, that it would change my life forever. Had he also foreseen how I would later have the opportunity to share this information with my friend in ways that would impact her life forever. It occurred to me how many more people could benefit from this information. After all, there is an infinite amount of light to share. All right. right, everybody. Hope you enjoyed these 3 stories from author Von Brashler's book, Time Shifts, Experiences of Slipping into the Past and Future. Please go rate, review, share, and subscribe at Strange Chapters to get more people to check into the show. And if you're not watching on YouTube, most of the episodes have a video component to them, make them a little more interesting. So go check out the YouTube page and make sure you subscribe. And until next time, we will see you later. Y'all stay safe out there and stay strange.